When I came back from dinner, the front door had a new lock, and my grandmother's house was already a stranger. The sentence landed in my mouth like cold coffee. It had that flat, impossible taste of something you don't expect and have to swallow anyway. I remember the way the light in the hallway looked that night. Yellow from a cheap bulb, the kind that makes everything appear smaller. I remember the sound of the neighbor's radio muffled through the wall. I remember thinking, for a moment, that this was a mistake, that some contractor had simply been overzealous, that it would be fixed in the morning. It wasn't. The contractor was polite. He wiped his hands on a rag as though he had done nothing more than change a latch. He showed me a receipt with a hurried signature. He said the family had authorized the work. He left with his van's back doors rattling shut, and the echo of his engine faded into the night. You can't imagine what's in the end. This real story helps you in your life. No one tells you before. Hello, my dear listeners. I'm Auntie Grace. Welcome to True Heart Voices, where every story finds its healing. Thank you for being here. If you love true stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. It helps keep these voices alive. I always find it fascinating to read which cities and countries you're listening from, so don't hesitate to write a comment. Now, sit back for a moment, and please get comfortable. Happy listening. Let's talk about what really happened. Grandma was inside, perched at the kitchen table like she always was. Small, steady, a soft sweater draped around her shoulders. Her hands were folded, the knuckles faintly pale, the bones thin. She looked up at me as I came through the door, and it was the look that undid me more than anything, confused, a little frightened, and somehow resigned. As if she had been waiting for this moment and had run out of words before it arrived. "Did you call me?" she asked. Slow as molasses. She always spoke like a story waiting to be told. "No," I said. "No, Grandma, I put my bag down." The leather whispering against the hall runner. "Who changed the lock?" My voice sounded smaller than I felt it should. She tapped the table with a frail finger and said, "Your cousin said it would be easier. Everyone is handling it. You don't need to worry." There was the name, my cousin, whom I hadn't seen in months, and the pronoun everyone, implying a committee rather than a conversation. That was how the whole thing began, with an umbrella word meant to soothe and a lock meant to shut me out. I lived 20 minutes away, in a small apartment that smelled perpetually of coffee and old paperbacks. Grandma's house was my childhood map, the blue tile in the kitchen where my toes would stick when I was small, the dent on the third stair where I once tripped and earned a bandaged knee, the backyard fence that leaned the way her stories leaned, always just a little to one side, but stubbornly standing. To see that map altered without my consent felt like someone redrawing my name on a family drawing. They called it rearranging the assets, an accountant's phrase meant to be tidy and unflinching, like a label on a box. But the details were anything but tidy. Paperwork moved faster than our visits. Signatures appeared where hands had not been asked, and one afternoon I discovered a document folded in a stack of junk mail, a hurried deed transfer, the notary stamp fresh as if it had just dried. My name was nowhere to be found. I remember the first sleepless night after that, the kind where time is measured by refrigerator hum and distant sirens. I sat at Grandma's kitchen table, the same place we'd eaten apples and watched soap operas for years, and I made lists, names, dates, who had keys, who had visited. I wrote things down because the act of writing made the world quieter and clearer. The lists gave me a map of where to look. When I first confronted my cousin, he answered with a syllable of surprise that could pass for innocence. "Oh, you saw that," he said, hands in his pockets, a shrug that suggested the world had been arranged for everyone's convenience. "We wanted to make things simpler for Grandma. Less paperwork, less hassle." "Less paperwork for whom?" I asked, because it looks like someone was in a hurry to move money. My voice was even. I had learned that even at my angriest, calm, words cut deeper. He smiled in that way family members smile when they're about to excuse themselves. "You don't understand the tax implications," he said. We did what was best. Best. The word sat heavy in the room like a chandelier. When people use best to hide something, it usually means there's profit in the wings. The deeper I dug, the stranger things looked. Receipts that didn't belong. Checks made out to estate services with numbers that didn't match. A power of attorney form supposedly signed months ago, except Grandma's handwriting there didn't look like Grandma's. My skin prickled, the way it does when something is wrong in the bones. The more I sifted, the more it felt like a slow-motion theft disguised as efficiency. There was a moment, 2 weeks into that slow unraveling, when the house felt like an evidence room. I found an old deed hidden in a shoebox under her bed, the real deed. The one with the old ink that had a little smudge where my grandfather must have rested his thumb. That paper smelled like 100 winters. It had been folded and folded until the edges were soft. Holding it in my hands felt like holding a promise. Whoever had pushed the transfer had not found that deed. They had submitted for a hurried sale based on other documents, the kind that look legal to someone who glances and nods. The discovery of the real deed was a small victory, but one I knew would have to be made into proof, not sentiment. Proof has the shape of facts and signatures and dates, everything I began to gather with the quiet determination that had been quietly building inside me since the man with the rag changed the lock. My son came to help. He is practical, organized, the sort who prints things twice and files them into neat stacks. He folded his hands when he looked at the deed, like someone in church. "We'll sort this," he said, not as a promise for tomorrow, but as an oath that we would methodically untangle the mess. We began by compiling every scrap of paper that suggested ownership: bank statements, emails, a canceled check from years ago, the kind of trivial thing people throw away, but the kind of trivial thing that, in cases of fraud, is a breadcrumb trail. We called neighbors, people who had seen this cousin with boxes of furniture, with men from a real estate office who insisted Grandma would be happier with less upkeep. One quiet afternoon, Aunt Liza, my aunt who likes to knit and keeps records in a notebook because paper is a friend, brought over a shoebox she'd kept in her closet. She set it on the table like she was setting down a ritual, and inside were letters, bills, and a yellowed envelope with a bank stamp. She nursed a cup of tea and told me, "I thought it was nothing. Families do things," but her eyes were bright. "I thought you should have it." Aunt Liza's voice trembled, not from fear so much as from the shock of watching how quickly small kindnesses can be turned into ledgers and then taken. We sat and went through the contents, and somewhere, between the print of an old mortgage statement and a letter from a lawyer, the pattern began to show itself. Transfers of small sums here, a hurried lien there, signatures that had been smoothed into legitimacy. I put my finger on the names, on the cousins and on the neighbor listed as a guarantor. The pattern was not elegant. It had the messy, opportunistic feel of people who want more than they earned. It was not the drama of a movie. It was the quiet grind of ledger lines and friendly smiles. And yet, even as I collected this paper trail, I was not naive about what courtrooms do. Courts have a rhythm not of righteous emotion, but of procedure. I wanted to be thorough enough that when we did go, our story would be an airtight one. No melodrama, no theatrics, just evidence. That was the work of care, to move through indignation with a steady pen rather than an impassioned yell. In those weeks, I learned the names of professionals the way other people learn singers. I dialed numbers and left messages for a lawyer who specialized in elder fraud. I met with a notary who told me what a forged signature looks like, where the pressure is different, where the hesitation shows. I paid a small man from a title company to search property records. He gave me a printout, and there, in a column of dates, was the entry for the transfer that had left Grandma's name replaced by something that read like Trust Services. When we finally sat across from the lawyer in her office, it felt like stepping into a calm room after stormy seas. She listened, asking few questions, and then she spoke, in that cool voice of professionals. "You have some strong leads. We can file a suit to reverse the transfer and request a stay on any property sale. But we'll need to show intent and falsified documents. The notary and title search help. Your witnesses help. Your timing helps. We'll build it slowly and surely." That was the plan. Slowly and surely is not glamorous, but it is effective. It's the difference between a bandage and a surgery. One covers, the other recalibrates. I liked the word sure. I wanted to be sure. I started attending small community meetings about elder rights. I talked to social workers who had seen cases like this morph from murmur to headline. They told me that greed often begins with small permissions. A favor here, a signed form there. By the time the elder notices, the architecture of the theft is complete. The people who do this are often relatives. They are not always monsters. They are sometimes the cousin who stops by too often with helpful hands and a smooth smile. They are sometimes the neighbor who says they can take care of things for you. Still, there were nights I cursed greed. I was human about it. I had ugly thoughts, but I also practiced restraint. I knew the story I needed to tell was not one of righteous fury, but of steady fact. A courtroom does not listen to fury, it listens to proof. That did not mean I would be passive, not at all. I began small acts of recuperation. I recorded conversations with my cousin. Short, polite queries about paperwork. I requested certified copies of documents. I filed FOIA requests where applicable. And I took pictures of the kitchen, the dented stair, the blue tile. I cataloged everything like a quiet detective. Neighbors began to look at me differently, some with sympathy, some with curiosity. One woman from down the street, who remembered Grandma's garden parties, offered to testify that she had seen moving trucks and men who didn't look like friends. The turning of neighbors from watchers into witnesses felt like a small victory. People, it turns out, have memories that serve justice if you ask them to speak. My son printed copies of emails and mailed them certified. Aunt Liza brought in old photographs of the house with dates written on the back. The evidence collected itself into a narrative I could see in the margins: the hurried sale, the missing deed, the forged mark, the family who benefited. Still, even as the trail laid itself out, the social landscape shifted underneath me. People who had been polite became distant. The cousin who had smiled now avoided my calls. A family member sent a message with a single line: "Let it go. Let it go." The phrase implies that injustice is a thing one can set aside like an old coat, but sometimes you must hold the coat up and show the moth holes. There were moments of anger, sharp and sudden. I would stand at the sink and bang a spoon against the bowl because the sound anchored me. But then I would breathe and pick up the phone and call another witness. The work was not glamorous. It was slow, and it required a patience I hadn't known I owned. At night, I would visit Grandma's house and sit with her as she folded the paper towels like origami. She often spoke of small things in a way that made them feel enormous. The taste of good bread, the song on the radio, the smell of rain. I listened, and I learned to be quiet with her. She did not always remember every detail of visits and signatures. She remembered affection. She remembered the shape of a hand. When she said, "They keep saying it's easier for me," I pressed my palm to hers and said, "We'll make it easy for you. There will be more to tell. There will be the moment when the courtroom door opens and the papers are laid down and a judge looks over us. There will be bruises to navigate, reputational, personal, familial, and there will be a public reckoning that is both cleaning and cruelty. For now, though, this is where I stop, at the kitchen table, with a shoebox of deeds, a lawyer's card in my wallet, and the small, stubborn belief that truth can be stitched back into a life with enough patience and proof. Before all the paperwork and the lawyers and the quiet war between relatives, there was just life, simple, ordinary, and soft around the edges. The way things are before you realize the moments you're living will one day become evidence. Grandma's house sat on a tree-lined street in a quiet corner of the city, the kind where everyone still waved when you drove by. The porch creaked in the same rhythm it had since I was a child, and the front steps leaned a little to the left, like an old friend with a secret limp. Every Sunday after church, I'd stop by with groceries, coffee, eggs, a loaf of sourdough she liked toasted thin, and we'd sit by the kitchen window to talk. It wasn't a big house, but it had that kind of peace that made you breathe easier when you stepped inside. The walls were lined with family pictures, faded prints from birthday parties, graduations, a few weddings that looked happier in photographs than they turned out to be in life. On the mantel, there was a photo of my grandfather in his Navy uniform, crisp posture, that steady smile, beside a porcelain figurine of a bird mid-flight. She said it reminded her that some things never really leave. They just fly differently. I'd always thought of that house as the last honest thing in our family, the one thing untouched by time, divorce, or anyone's bad decisions. But it started changing before I even noticed. It began small, my cousin showing up more often, fixing a light bulb here, carrying boxes to the attic. At first I was grateful. I worked long hours, the kind that leave you numb and tired by evening, so having someone else help Grandma felt like a blessing. I'd come by on Thursdays and he'd already be there, smiling, saying things like, "We've got it covered. You work too hard." It sounded kind, helpful, but kindness said too often can sometimes mean we're making decisions without you. Grandma would beam when he left, calling him a good boy. I didn't correct her. I wanted to believe it too. We were a family of complicated people, stitched together by habit more than harmony. Aunt Liza was the peacemaker, soft-spoken, practical. My mother had been the eldest, the one who handled the serious things before she passed, and after her, Grandma and I had grown even closer. My cousin, let's call him Daniel, was her favorite son, charming, funny when he wanted to be, and dangerous in the way people can be when they confuse confidence with goodness. He knew how to fill a room with stories, how to laugh in a way that made people trust him. I used to think that was a gift. Later, I'd learn it was his best disguise. Every Friday, Grandma would sit at the kitchen table and sort through her mail. It was her ritual. She'd line up the envelopes, tap them on the table like she was shuffling cards, and hum softly. An old hymn, something about mercy and light. I'd pour tea and she'd tell me stories about her mother's garden, about the time she nearly eloped with Grandpa before his deployment. There was always laughter in those afternoons, soft and slow, the kind that floats like dust in the sun. Then, slowly the rhythm changed. One Thursday I arrived to find new folders stacked on the table, tidy, official, labeled with post-it notes, utilities, insurance, property. Daniel sat beside her, flipping through the papers like a man with a plan. "Oh, we're just getting things in order," he said, casual as ever. Grandma nodded along, smiling. "He's helping me simplify things," she said, her tone proud, like she'd just hired her own secretary. I remember glancing at one of the folders, saw a logo for a financial advisory firm I didn't recognize. I thought it odd, but didn't press. You don't question help when it looks polite. That night, though, something tugged at me. I couldn't name it. Just a flicker of unease, like a splinter in the back of my mind. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the pharmacy. Grandma's prescription account had been updated under a new billing contact. They wanted confirmation. I drove straight there, confusion simmering beneath my calm. At the counter, they showed me the name, Daniel. I told myself maybe he was just trying to make things easier for her. Maybe he was helping with errands, but when I mentioned it to him later, his smile was just a little too smooth. "Yeah," he said. "She asked me to. You've got your job, I've got time. It's just easier this way." That word again. Easier. People use easier when they mean don't look too close. Still, I tried to let it go. Families operate on faith more than logic. You want to believe the people you love are being kind, not cunning. I'd visit, and the house would feel different, brighter, but in a way that felt staged. Fresh paint on the hallway walls, boxes moved. Grandma's favorite chair gone for repair. When I asked, Daniel would say, "We're updating a few things for her comfort." He always said we, never I, never me. And we made it sound like everyone had agreed. as though silence meant consent. One Saturday morning, I came by with a blueberry pie. Grandma was sitting near the window, sunlight slanting through the lace curtain. Her hair was freshly set. She looked peaceful. Daniel wasn't there, so I asked gently, "What are these forms?" pointing to a pile of new papers by the fruit bowl. "Oh, honey, that's just the house. He says it's complicated." Her tone was calm, but her eyes had that flicker, like a bird sensing a storm. I lifted one of the pages, a form for transfer of title, her name printed cleanly in the upper box, the signature shaky and thin. I felt my chest tighten. "Did you sign this?" I asked. She hesitated, looking toward the kitchen doorway like she expected Daniel to walk in. "He said it was just for insurance," she murmured. Insurance. The word landed like a stone. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. Not a misunderstanding, not confusion, wrong. But even then, I tried to protect her peace. I didn't want her to worry or feel betrayed by her own blood. So I told her I'd look into it. She nodded, trusting as always, and went back to folding her napkin, humming that same hymn about mercy. Mercy. How strange a word can sound when you realize not everyone deserves it. I went home that night and started digging. Not online, not through gossip, but through old files, old emails, anything with an address, a bank, a name. That's when I found it. A notice of transfer from the county office, filed, processed, except the date listed was 2 days before Daniel had supposedly helped her with paperwork, which meant he had already initiated the process before she even knew there was paperwork to sign. That realization, that premeditation, hit different. It meant this wasn't an accident. This was orchestration, a play written behind closed doors. And yet, before the full betrayal unraveled, before the courtrooms and affidavits, there were still quiet moments of ordinary life that made the coming storm even harder to bear. Because the more normal things seemed, the more haunting it felt to see how easily evil can wear a familiar face. Grandma kept baking pies, folding laundry, watching her shows. Daniel kept visiting, bringing her groceries, smiling like a good grandson. And me? I kept pretending I wasn't afraid of what I was starting to uncover. There's something lonely about being the only one in a family who starts asking questions. People call it suspicion. They whisper about you like you're the problem. But I learned suspicion is just the body's way of recognizing truth before the mind catches up. Aunt Liza noticed too, eventually. She stopped me one afternoon outside church, her hands cold and trembling slightly. "He's been asking me about the house," she whispered, "about whether Grandma ever mentioned a will." Her voice cracked on the word will. I looked at her and said, "She hasn't. But maybe it's time she did." The weeks that followed were a slow balancing act, pretending calm for Grandma's sake while quietly collecting small pieces of evidence, receipts, signatures, letters. Every visit became observation, every smile a question mark, every kindness a potential transaction. But even through all that tension, there were moments of beauty I still hold close, like the afternoon when Grandma insisted on showing me her garden, pointing out the last of the marigolds before winter took them. She leaned on her cane, her hand brushing the petals. She said softly, "You take care of what you love, even when it's tired." I didn't realize until much later how much that line would echo through everything that came after. Life before the storm had its quiet order, a house with old floors and newer secrets. But the stillness was just the inhale before the truth exhaled. The night before the lock changed, Grandma called me. Her voice was small. "They said they'll finish everything tomorrow," she said. "Who's they?" I asked. "The men Daniel brought. Something about the closing papers. He said you knew." I didn't know. And that was the moment everything in me went cold. Because when someone starts speaking of closing something that was never open, you realize the house you thought was home has become a deal. That night, I couldn't sleep. The refrigerator hum sounded like static. The clock ticked louder than it should. I told myself I'd drive over first thing in the morning, but morning came with a call from a contractor and a new lock on a door that used to open freely to my key. That was the beginning of the unraveling, the end of the quiet before the storm. When the contractor called, his voice was polite, almost rehearsed. He said, "Ma'am, I just wanted to confirm the flooring materials before we start the demo." Demo. That word didn't belong anywhere near Grandma's house. "What demo?" I asked. There was a pause, the kind that tells you the other person just realized you're not part of whatever script they've been following. "The renovation project," he said carefully. "It's part of the sale terms. I was told the new owners would be moving in next month." I didn't even feel my knees weaken. It was one of those moments when your body goes still instead, like your nerves retreat to keep you from falling apart. I said, "Could you repeat that?" And he did, slowly, word for word. By the time he finished, I was already grabbing my keys. The drive to Grandma's felt longer than usual. The streets were too calm. Even the stoplights seemed to take their time turning green, as if the world itself didn't want me to reach the truth too fast. When I pulled up, the first thing I saw was the contractor's truck out front, idling. A man stood near the porch, clipboard in hand, looking puzzled. The second thing I saw, the brass lock on the front door, shining new. My key didn't fit. That small, metallic refusal hit harder than a slap. The house I'd grown up in, the one where every creak and hum felt like family, had just told me, "You don't belong here anymore." The contractor walked over, uneasy. "You're the daughter, right?" "Granddaughter," I corrected, my voice steady. He looked at his notes. "I was told this property was cleared. The sale closed 2 days ago." "Who told you that?" He checked his clipboard. Mr. Daniel." Of course. I swallowed hard, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "There's been a mistake," I said. "Nobody had permission to sell this house." He frowned. "Ma'am, I've got the documents right here. Signatures, notary stamps." He trailed off when he saw my face. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I'm just doing my job." I thanked him. Not because he deserved thanks, but because I needed to keep him talking. I asked for a copy of his work order for insurance, and he handed it over. That small stack of papers would later become my first real clue, and my first piece of evidence. When I finally got inside, through the back door which still used the old lock, the air felt wrong. The rooms were too empty. Boxes missing, photos gone. The smell of lemon polish replaced the familiar scent of coffee and lavender soap. Grandma wasn't there. Her bedroom light was off, her robe folded neatly on the chair. On her dresser sat a single envelope with my name written in her shaky handwriting. Inside, a note, short and uncertain. "He says we have to move out for a little while." Something about taxes. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll be staying with Aunt Liza. Everything's fine." Everything's fine. The most dangerous sentence in the world. That night, I called Aunt Liza. She answered on the third ring, her voice hushed. "She's asleep," she said. "Where?" "At my house. She's been here since yesterday. Daniel dropped her off with a suitcase and said he'd handle the paperwork." "Did she seem worried?" Aunt Liza hesitated. "She seemed tired, but she trusts him." Trust, such a fragile word. So easy to break, so hard to rebuild. I didn't want to alarm her, so I said, "I'll come by tomorrow." But instead of sleeping, I stayed up all night with Grandma's note on the table, the contractor's papers beside it. I traced every name, every date, every signature. One stood out. The notary's seal. The name looked familiar. I searched it online. The notary's office was listed at a downtown address, a firm I remembered from my own work in accounting. But the signature on the document didn't match the one on their website. That was the first undeniable crack in the lie. By morning, I was running on caffeine and anger. I called the county records office and asked for a copy of the property transfer deed. The woman on the line said cheerfully, "Of course. It's public record now." She emailed it within minutes. When I opened it, the air left my lungs. There it was, my grandmother's name listed as seller, buyer, a real estate LLC I'd never heard of. Filed, notarized, processed, signed 3 weeks ago. But Grandma hadn't left the house in months. That's when it stopped being suspicion and became certainty. I knew what I had to do. First, I called the notary office. A woman picked up. Older, professional tone. When I gave her the document number, she said flatly, "That's not my signature." I asked, "Could you send me something in writing confirming that?" She hesitated, then said, "You might want to contact an attorney. That's not the first time we've seen something like this." That one sentence told me more than she realized. Elder fraud, property flipping, forged consent, the quiet crimes of family betrayal that happen behind kitchen doors, and notarized lies. That afternoon, I drove to Aunt Liza's. Grandma was sitting on the couch knitting, her hands trembling just slightly. She looked up, smiling. "There you are, sweetheart." I hugged her gently and sat beside her. "Grandma," I said, keeping my voice steady, "do you remember signing anything for the house?" Her eyes went distant. "Oh, honey, there were so many papers. He said it was about refinancing for better taxes." My heart sank. "Did anyone explain it to you?" She shook her head. "I didn't want to bother you at work." That sentence broke me a little, because that's how it always starts, with trust, exhaustion, and someone too polite to ask questions. When I told Aunt Liza what I'd found, she went pale. "You're saying he sold it?" I nodded. "Without her consent, and I think he's using fake documents to cover it up." She clasped her hands, whispering, "Dear God." But prayer wasn't going to fix this. Evidence would. So I went back to the house, not inside. I couldn't risk being accused of trespassing, but around the perimeter, checking windows, peeking through blinds. The living room was stripped bare. Even the bird figurine was gone. I took photos of everything: the lock, the contractor's truck, the empty rooms. Then I started building my file. Every email, every note, every timestamp. I labeled it House Fraud Evidence, a folder born of heartbreak and necessity. Over the next week, Daniel stopped returning calls. His voicemail changed. A new number, new tone. Leave a message after the beep. When I did reach him once, his response was slippery as oil. "Why are you getting so dramatic? It's handled. You'll understand when it's all done." "Handled how?" I asked. "Legally." He hung up. I realized then that he wasn't just reckless. He was confident, which meant he thought he'd covered his tracks. That made me furious, but also strategic. Because people who think they're invincible always make one mistake. They underestimate the quiet ones. So I became quiet. I stopped confronting, stopped calling. I let him think I'd given up. Meanwhile, I was learning everything I could. Public records, court filings, title histories. I even spoke with a retired paralegal who used to handle property fraud cases. She told me what to look for: timestamps, inconsistencies in witness initials, mismatched ink. When I compared Grandma's signature on the sale deed to her actual signature on old greeting cards, the difference was undeniable. Her handwriting had a loop on the M. The deed version didn't. Forgery, plain as day. And the notary date, 2 days after the supposed signing, proved someone backdated it. Piece by piece, I was reconstructing the truth. And every detail made the betrayal sharper, because this wasn't just about money or property. It was about family, about a house that had been our history, our gatherings, our safety, and someone had turned it into a transaction. When I told Grandma what I'd found, she went silent for a long time. Then she said softly, "I always wondered why he wouldn't let me read the papers." Her voice cracked. I thought maybe he didn't want me to see my own mistakes. I reached for her hand. "You didn't make any, Grandma. You trusted the wrong person." "That's not the same thing." From that moment, I stopped thinking like a relative and started thinking like an investigator. I filed an inquiry with the County Fraud Division. I reached out to an attorney who specialized in elder property cases, a woman named Ms. Rivera, sharp-eyed and kind. When she heard my story, she didn't interrupt. She just said, "I've seen this pattern before, but the difference is, you caught it early." She told me the first step was to halt any renovations or further transfers. So we filed a temporary injunction. By the end of that week, a court order was in place. No modifications, no sales, no demolitions until the ownership dispute was resolved. Daniel didn't see it coming. He called that night, furious. "You had no right," he shouted. "You're making this worse." I let him finish. Then I said calmly, "You already made it worse when you forged her name." Silence. Then, click. For the first time in weeks, I slept, not deeply, but enough to dream of that house as it used to be. Warm light, the smell of pie, the sound of Grandma humming in the kitchen. But dreams don't last long when the truth's still unfolding, because the next morning, a new envelope arrived. This time, from Daniel's lawyer, a cease and desist letter. He was claiming I was harassing him. I remember reading it, then laughing, quietly, bitterly, because that's what guilt does. It tries to turn itself into innocence. But the letter also meant one thing. He was scared. And that meant the real fight was about to begin. That was the day I decided. If they could sell Grandma's house while she ate dinner, then I could take back every brick, legally, publicly, and with proof. When I walked into Ms. Rivera's office the following week, I expected answers. What I didn't expect was a file already waiting on her desk with my family's name printed across the front. She motioned for me to sit. "Before we move forward," she said, "you need to see this." Inside the folder were documents, neat, printed, official-looking, and one name appearing again and again: Daniel Crawford. There were bank records, transfers, receipts, each one small, ordinary, but together they painted a story of quiet theft hidden beneath signatures and trust. He'd set up an LLC 6 months ago, a fake buyer, Fairfield Renovations Group, and in that LLC's account, there were deposits that didn't belong. Not from investors, not from loans, from family accounts, Grandma's pension fund, her savings, even a check labeled insurance refund, cashed and rerouted. I stared at the papers. How long has this been going on? Ms. Rivera leaned back, eyes steady, long enough that he got comfortable. Comfortable. That word hit me hard because comfort meant this wasn't an accident. He'd planned it, calculated it, probably smiled while doing it. She pushed another document across the desk, a digital printout of an email thread. At the top, Daniel's name. Below it, messages with a realtor. "We'll need to expedite the sale. The elderly owner's granddaughter is too emotionally attached, as if caring was a weakness." I didn't cry. Not then. I'd already cried when the locks changed, when Grandma's robe folded on that chair. Now I just felt sharp, focused. Ms. Rivera said, "We can pursue this civilly, but if you're ready, I recommend pressing charges for elder financial abuse and property fraud." I nodded before she finished the sentence. "Do it." That was the moment I crossed from disbelief into battle. The next few weeks were a blur of filings, affidavits, and statements. Grandma gave her testimony, quietly, nervously, saying how she'd trusted him, how he'd handled all the papers, how she'd believed she was refinancing. I sat beside her the whole time, holding her hand. When it came time for my statement, I focused on the details, dates, documents, the notary's denial. No theatrics, just facts. Because truth doesn't need volume, it needs patience. 2 days later, the sheriff's office contacted Ms. Rivera. They'd found discrepancies, not just in Grandma's case, but in 2 others linked to the same LLC. Different houses, same paperwork pattern, same forged witness initials. That's when everything clicked. He hadn't just stolen from family. He'd built a business out of betrayal. When the subpoena came, it felt surreal. Daniel had to appear in court for the preliminary hearing. Aunt Liza came too, quiet as ever, clutching her rosary like armor. Grandma wore her best church dress, pale blue with small pearls at the collar. The courtroom was smaller than I imagined. Just benches, fluorescent lights, and a judge who looked tired but fair. When Daniel walked in, he didn't look nervous. He looked offended, like this was an inconvenience, not a reckoning. He didn't glance at us, not once. The clerk read the charges: forgery, fraud, elder exploitation, real estate misrepresentation. His lawyer, a slick man with too perfect hair, stood and said calmly, "My client maintains that this was a misunderstanding between family members, a matter better handled privately, not in court." I felt Grandma stiffen beside me. Her hand found mine, cold, trembling. The judge nodded, noting the statement, but his eyes lingered on our side of the room. Then he said, "Let's see the evidence." Ms. Rivera stood. And the way she laid out those papers, measured, precise, was like watching truth being built brick by brick. Every transfer, every fake document, every forged signature, lined up, labeled, undeniable. At one point she said, "Your Honor, notice the inconsistency in the notary seal date. It predates the seller's alleged consent by 48 hours. This demonstrates deliberate falsification." Daniel's lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge held up a hand. "Counselor, let her finish." The air was thick with silence. Even the bailiff stopped fidgeting. When Ms. Rivera finally sat down, Daniel's lawyer whispered something to him. But Daniel just stared at the table, jaw tight. Then came the moment I didn't expect. The judge looked at Grandma. He said gently, "Ma'am, do you wish to say anything?" She rose slowly, gripping her cane. Her voice trembled, but it carried. "I trusted him," she said. "He's my own blood. I thought he was helping. I thought he loved me." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. "I may be old, Your Honor, but I'm not stupid. I just didn't think someone I raised could do this." Silence fell again, a deep human silence, the kind that fills a room heavier than any gavel. When she sat down, the judge simply said, "Thank you, ma'am." Then he turned to Daniel. "You have the right to respond." Daniel stood. His voice was calm, almost bored. "This has been blown out of proportion. I was managing her finances because she asked me to. If there were errors, they weren't intentional. The house was draining money. I was trying to help. Help, that word again. Hollow and sharp." Ms. Rivera leaned forward slightly, her tone measured. "Your Honor, the alleged help included unauthorized withdrawals and forged signatures on state-certified documents." The judge scribbled something down. Then he looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Crawford, you're either grossly negligent or criminally deceptive. Either way, this will proceed to trial." And just like that, the hearing ended. Outside the courtroom, Grandma seemed small in her blue dress, but her eyes had a strange calm. She said quietly, "It's not the money. It's the shame." I told her, "The shame isn't yours." She nodded, though I could tell she didn't believe it yet. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, staring at the city lights. The world looked normal again. Traffic, laughter, people walking dogs, but nothing felt normal. Because betrayal changes the way light falls. It changes how silence sounds. The next few days were filled with reporters calling Miss Rivera's office, small-town media catching wind of the family fraud case. She shielded Grandma from it, but I read every article. Each one reduced us to a headline: "Grandson accused of defrauding elderly relative." They didn't print the parts that mattered: the kindness, the trust, the nights Grandma stayed up praying he'd call, because those don't sell papers. But I wasn't after headlines. I wanted resolution. And then, one morning, something unexpected arrived. A letter, handwritten, from Daniel. It wasn't long, barely a page. He wrote that he never meant for it to go that far, that he'd been under pressure, that family should forgive family. At the bottom, just before his signature, he'd added, "You'll never understand why I did it." He was right. I wouldn't, because there's no math in the world that can explain stealing from someone who raised you with love. I showed the letter to Miss Rivera. She sighed. "It's not an admission, but it helps show intent. Keep it." So I did. I folded it carefully, tucked it into the evidence file. Not for the case, for me. A reminder that closure doesn't come from apologies. It comes from truth. The trial was set for early fall. By then, the leaves had started to turn, reds and golds painting the streets outside the courthouse. Grandma's health was fragile, but she insisted on coming. "I want to see it finished," she said. And she did, because that day, when the verdict was read, when the gavel hit wood, justice finally caught up to deceit. Guilty on all counts. Daniel didn't look back when they led him out. He just stared forward, face blank, as if this was all someone else's story. But for us, for Grandma, for me, for the house that carried generations, it wasn't someone else's story. It was ours. And it ended, not with forgiveness or rage, but with peace. Afterward, Grandma said something I'll never forget. She looked out the courthouse window. watching the leaves fall, and said, "Maybe this was the only way I'd ever really see who people are." Then she smiled. Small, weary, beautiful, and maybe that's its own kind of blessing. When we stepped outside that courthouse, the air felt different, cooler, lighter, almost like the city itself had exhaled with us. Grandma took a long breath and said, "Well, that's done." I smiled faintly. Almost, the word almost lingered between us, because though justice had spoken, healing hadn't yet. We drove home in silence, not the tense kind, but the kind that feels necessary, like words would only bruise what peace had just begun to form. The house, her house, stood quiet as ever, the porch light flickering from age. Ms. Rivera had arranged for the title to be restored. The paperwork was final. The court's ruling made it clear. The deed, the property, every right belonged to Grandma again. But when we walked in, she didn't smile. She just stood there in the entryway, looking around slowly. "It feels smaller," she said softly. Maybe it was the months of emptiness that made the walls feel thinner, the rooms quieter. Or maybe betrayal does something to space. It empties it of safety. I set her coat on the hook and said, "We'll fill it again." And we did. One small piece at a time. The first weekend, I helped her unpack her old dishes, white porcelain with tiny blue violets around the edges, the same set she'd used every Sunday since I was a kid. We washed them together, her humming quietly as she wiped each plate dry. The sound of that hum, I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it. She cooked again, too. Not much, just stew, cornbread, a pot of tea. But the smell alone made the house feel alive. One evening, as we ate at the kitchen table, she said, "I keep thinking about when he was little, how he used to run through this hallway pretending to be a superhero." She smiled at the memory, though her eyes glistened. "I guess sometimes they grow up and start thinking they don't need saving anymore." I reached across the table and held her hand. "He saved himself from nothing," I said quietly. "He just lost sight of what mattered." Days turned into weeks, and slowly the house began to heal with us. Ms. Rivera called to check in, saying the property transfer had been formally recorded. The news coverage faded, and one morning, Grandma woke up and decided she wanted to garden again. We spent that afternoon pulling weeds, trimming roses, replanting the marigolds. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were bright. At one point, she looked up at me and said, "You know what hurts the most? Not that he took the house. It's that he didn't think I'd notice. As if my love made me blind." I brushed dirt off my gloves. "Maybe love does make us blind, but not stupid." She laughed softly. "No, maybe just hopeful." That night I stayed a little longer than usual. After she went to bed, I walked through the house. The creak of the floorboards, the faint smell of lavender from her linen spray. Every corner carried memory. The wall where she'd measured my height, the chair where Grandpa used to read, the window she'd always kept cracked open so the house could breathe. And standing there, I realized something. This wasn't just about a house. It was about belonging. It was about the invisible threads that tie us to who we are, and how easy it is for greed to cut them, if we let it. Weeks later, Daniel's sentencing was finalized. 2 years probation, restitution, community service. Some thought it was too light. Others said it was fair. But Grandma, she just nodded and said, "Let God sort the rest." She didn't speak his name again after that. Not out of anger, out of peace. Sometimes letting go isn't forgetting. It's choosing quiet over chaos. A few months passed before the house truly began to feel like home again. Neighbors started stopping by with casseroles and pies, like some unspoken way of saying, "We saw, we know, we care." Grandma thanked them all with her soft smile, the kind that said, "I'm okay now." One evening I found her sitting by the living room window watching the sunset. The light caught the edge of her face, soft and golden. "You know," she said, "your grandfather used to say every storm leaves a cleaner sky." I nodded. He was right. She smiled faintly. This one left a clearer heart, too. There was a comfort in that silence. Not empty, but earned. By late autumn, we started repainting the porch. I brushed on the soft cream color she'd chosen decades ago. And when I finished the last section, Grandma stood back and said, "Looks just like before." I smiled. "No," I said. "It looks stronger." We both laughed, and the sound felt freeing, because laughter, after everything, felt like the truest kind of victory. Later that night, after she'd gone to bed, I walked out to the yard. The air smelled like wood and paint, a mix of old and new, and as I looked up at the house, the windows glowing softly from her bedside lamp, I thought about everything that had happened, the lies, the signatures, the trial, the silence that followed, and the strength it took to rebuild. Then I thought of something Ms. Rivera had said months earlier. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And standing there beneath the porch light, I understood what she meant. Justice wasn't the gavel's echo or the verdict's sting. It was Grandma's hum in the kitchen again. It was the creak of her rocking chair. It was peace restored, one quiet breath at a time. Sometimes life doesn't give back what's taken. It gives something else instead. Perspective. A gentler way to see the world. To understand pain without letting it define you. And maybe that's the real inheritance. It's been almost a year now. The seasons turned quietly, like pages in an old book, and the house that once felt haunted by betrayal is now full of small, ordinary sounds again. The kettle's whistle, the hum of the old refrigerator, the rustle of curtains when the breeze slips through. Sometimes Grandma forgets a few details about the court or what month it all happened in, but she remembers how it felt, the shock, the ache, the resolve, and maybe that's all memory needs to hold on to, not the facts, but the truth. One morning I came by and found her sitting on the porch swing with a cup of tea. The sky was pale pink, the air sharp with early spring chill. She looked at me and said, "You know, I don't hate him." Her words hung there, quiet but heavy. "I thought I would," she went on, "but hate takes energy I'd rather spend on my garden." Then she sipped her tea, eyes drifting toward the yard where tulip bulbs were beginning to sprout. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat beside her. And in that silence, I realized forgiveness isn't always about the person who wronged you. Sometimes it's about freeing yourself from the version of you that hurt the most, because pain has a way of making a home in us. If we don't open the windows and let it breathe, it lingers. That afternoon, I stayed longer than I meant to. We walked the garden paths together, her hand resting lightly on my arm. When she paused to admire a rosebud pushing through the soil, she smiled and said, "Funny, isn't it? Even after winter, things find a way." I nodded. Yeah, they do. The truth is, this story could have ended differently. The house could have stayed lost. The lies could have buried us in bitterness. But sometimes, the smallest act, asking one more question, trusting one quiet instinct, can shift everything. And for all the nights I spent doubting myself, replaying every decision, every word, I've learned this. Justice isn't just about laws or courtrooms. It's about courage. The kind that doesn't shout, but whispers, "Keep going." Now, whenever I visit, Grandma insists I take something from her garden. A small jar of honey from her neighbor's bees, a bunch of herbs. Once she handed me a single rose and said, "Keep this where you'll see it, so you remember. Some roots go deeper than betrayal." That rose has long since dried, but I still keep it pressed in a book by my bed. A reminder that even when people you love betray you, not everything dies in the fire. Some things, like truth or love that's real, survive the burn. Sometimes I think about Daniel, where he is now, whether he regrets it. And maybe he does, but I don't need to know, because knowing wouldn't change the ending. And endings aren't where the lesson lives anyway. It's in the middle, where you decide who you'll be after everything breaks. And me? I decided I'd rather be my grandmother's granddaughter than anyone else's victim. Before I go, I want to tell you something. Something Grandma told me the night we first came back home. She said, "When someone steals your peace, don't chase them. Just rebuild your peace bigger." And she was right, because that's what we did. We built something stronger, steadier, something no forged paper or greedy hand could ever take again. So tonight, if you're listening to this and someone's tried to take what's yours, your home, your dignity, your peace, remember this: what they stole doesn't define you. What you rebuild does. Would I do it all again? The late nights, the searching, the courtroom stares? Yes, because some battles aren't just about property or pride. They're about proving to yourself that you still have a voice. And sometimes that voice can change everything. Tell me, have you ever fought for something everyone else said was already lost? I'd like to hear your story. Sometimes life takes from us, but sometimes it teaches us too. If this story touched you today, if it reminded you of something you've lived through, please don't keep it inside. Tell me your story. Thank you in advance for sharing this moment with me. I wonder, which part of this story stayed with you? Which moment did you feel deep in your chest? And where are you listening from? Tell me in the comments. I personally read every single comment myself because your words might be the light someone else needs tonight. And if you haven't yet, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because here at True Heart Voices, every story deserves to be heard, and every heart deserves to heal. Did you like my story? If you listened all the way to the end, drop a number 1 in the comments. If you enjoyed it, you can support me by liking the video and sending a small tip. I've got many more life stories just like this on my channel, so make sure to subscribe and check them out. I've added 2 new stories on screen that everyone loves. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next one. With love.